Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. I thought today we would talk about the Valiant. Usually when it comes to ground vehicles, a lot of them have decent stories, a lot of them have a lot of praise. The Valiant is one of those vehicles for Britain which has got a lot of criticism, is probably the way to put it, even being labelled one of the worst tanks of all time. And I thought we would do a video on it in this series to basically talk about its history, and also how, just like a lot of other vehicles in life which didn't work very well or never really got past testing, guess what? They can work in War Thunder. And the Valiant is one of those vehicles. So let's get into the A38 Valiant. If you enjoy the content, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video. In 1942, there was a thought from the powers that be that what was required was a new heavy assault tank. And basically what this needed was certain characteristics. 100mm of armor on the front of it, it needed specific guns, it also needed a specific general design. And what happened in August of that year is the Ministry of Supply awarded a contract to Vickers Armstrong to produce 3 prototypes of this idea. Now, Vickers obviously already had the Valentine series, which was kind of similar in its role, but not as heavily armored as the general vehicle. And since Vickers was awarded this contract, they decided to start designing the vehicle based off some interesting ideas around the Valentine. Not specifically the Valentine itself, but what is known as the Vickers Vanguard. Now, the Vickers Vanguard was a development of the Valentine. There was actually a few different developments of it, and maybe we'll go into them in future videos, but the Vanguard itself is the one that we're going to kind of have a look at. Now, this vehicle is pretty simple. It has a different suspension system compared to the Valentine and a few different characteristics, but you can definitely tell that it was a development of it. Eventually, what happened when it came to the Vanguard, it had its first trials, and it was used with the QF 17-pounder gun, hilariously enough, and this eventually became the Archer SPG because of the fact that the Ministry of Supply, or the tank boards, wanted a vehicle which could mount the 17-pounder as well, and this was something that Vickers were working on. So the Vanguard was tested as a standard medium tank, or an assault tank as it was called at the time. Then they decided to trial it with a 17-pounder gun, and then eventually this became the Archer SPG, which used the standard Valentine chassis. But the Vanguard wasn't done there with its different suspension design. It went on to become the Valiant. The Vanguard itself was actually, or the Valiant, I should say, was actually referred to as the Vanguard for at least the first few months of the development of the Valiant itself, which was kind of interesting. At the time, the suspension was kind of the suspension itself was generally designed for about 20 tons, but the vehicle itself was 23, so it was already having a few issues when it came to its suspension idea. But they also decided to change a few different things in the process. Other features of this Valiant tank when it started out were the 6-pounder gun, so the 57mm, and then also a coaxial 7.92mm gun. And as the design went on, they added a few interesting features which were adopted from the Vanguard. The Vanguard itself was actually one of the first vehicles which had the pike-nosed design on it, which of course became famous with stuff such as the IS-3 and many other Soviet vehicles. A lot of the heavy tanks at the time, around 1944 to 49, built by the Soviets, had this pike-nosed design, and it even went further on from there. The reason why they liked the 6-pounder is the fact that it wasn't just something that could be used in an anti-tank role, it was also something which could be used in a anti-infantry role or any other setup. It had a variety of ammunition, compared to the 2-pounder, which was very much a simple gun compared to the 57. Then you also had the 75, which would come in as well. The actual engine on the vehicle itself, when it came down to it, it was tested with 2 separate engines, the main one being the Rolls-Royce Meteorite. This was a proposed 8-cylinder engine capable of 400 horsepower. Now, technically, this meant that the vehicle could go up to 25 kilometers an hour, which was not too bad for an assault vehicle, because you've got to remember the idea of an assault tank is that it's plonked near the enemy lines and then it's pushed forward with. And then the main issue with it, though, was that it only had a range of 100 miles, or at least the design specification ranged it at 100 miles, which isn't a lot, but once again, it's an assault tank and doesn't really have to go too far in the action. The main problems that this vehicle ran into was the actual transmission and mainly the gearbox. It had a 5-speed synchro mesh gearbox. It stuck in many areas, which led to a lot of issues when it came to the driver that we'll get into later on in the testing area. But mainly what you had, it was a pretty standard one, which once again was similar to other vehicles before it. The suspension was actually pretty interesting. So this is where it kind of differs from the Valentine design and where the Vanguard takes over. This consisted of 6 pairs of road wheels per side. They had rubber-tired road wheels, of course, and then they had transverse spring units, which was supported by an internal spring and a wishbone mount. Now, one of the problems with the wishbone mount is if you hit stuff at a specific angle, especially with the additional weight on it, which it wasn't designed for, this would generally crack, which is obviously not great. The shock absorbers, though, it had were in the form of 8 hydraulic double piston stations, and they generally worked pretty well. And overall, if the suspension wasn't overloaded by weight, this thing probably would have worked pretty well. And then this is where, in my opinion, the downfall of the Valiant began. So we've talked about, the Vanguard, where it was pretty much modified into the Valiant itself. And then the next step comes where there's just a ton of different hands on the project. So the first thing was that the tank ministry decided that this issue or this vehicle was set as low priority. They wanted to focus on their tanks that they already had, and also they wanted to focus on the building of American tanks. So since this was downgraded to a low priority, and also there were amendments to the contract itself, basically what they wanted to use was they wanted to use the AEC-produced A189 petrol engine. This produced a 135 or 138 horsepower, which is just not great for the vehicle. They also wanted to change the turret. Instead of having a 2-man, which is what the Vanguard had to reduce weight, now they wanted a 3-man turret, which would be more similar to what we've seen before. They also wanted to change the gun to a 75mm, because unfortunately the 6-pounder on the Valentine Mark 9 was not really working out too well. So they wanted to change that from February of 1943. So there was 3 main things that changed in the actual design projection, like what they wanted to build. And Vickers basically went, well, to be honest with you, you've decided that you've changed all this stuff that we wanted to push through. Also, at the same time, we're working on all of these other things. We can farm this off to another party. So they tried to bring in a new parent designer to work on the vehicle. And the people who were available at the time were not many, to be honest with you. They went to Rolls-Royce because Rolls-Royce were designing the transmission and the engine area. So the vehicle was moved to Rolls-Royce to work on. And what they decided to do was to add some stuff which didn't exactly help the vehicle itself. The first thing that was changed was the engine deck itself. the exhaust openings were actually facing upwards on it instead of on the sides of it. On the sides of it, where they were before, they basically welded more plates on it, so more armor, but also more weight. And then underneath, where the transmission housing was, they decided it needed to be up-armored, even though it was on the bottom of the vehicle. So they welded several large plates below the transmission. Now, this obviously had some negative impacts on the vehicle. It basically meant that their ground clearance was lower, and also there was way more stress on the suspension itself, therefore sagging the vehicle down. And over time, this would obviously just get worse, especially if it wasn't treated. This meant that in May of 1945, the suspension had 10 inches of ground clearance at the rear and 8.9 inches from the rear suspension units, which obviously isn't great if you want to do some maintenance, but mainly the issue when it comes to this vehicle is the fact that it would have got stuck on rough terrain, or it would have got stuck on rocks, or not necessarily stuck, but it would have scraped against everything and been very uncomfortable. So after Rolls-Royce screwed with the engine deck and also the transmission, it was then farmed off to Ruston and Hornsby. Now, Ruston and Hornsby, I suppose, kind of gets a bad name from the Valiant, but also at the same time, it was given to them, and they weren't really tank designers, right? The Ruston and Hornsby, they're based in Lincolnshire, and based in Lincoln itself, and they were mainly used to build stuff like tractors or steam locomotives or cars, or even stuff like steam shovels and things like that. They weren't tank people. They had during the war, just like how a lot of people in the UK, a lot of companies were basically changed to wartime situation, which meant that they either built planes, or they built tanks, or they built, stuff for the armed forces, but they only had produced them. They had never designed anything on this scale. So they were given this. This vehicle. Now the Ministry of Supply actually gave the vehicle a name, the A38 Valiant, and they also terminated the existing contract with Vickers Armstrong after giving it to these guys. So Ruston and Hornsby had actually produced the A12 Matilda II, which was a vehicle which served all throughout the war for Great Britain, which is, generally seen as quite nice. But the changes they made to the Valiant probably weren't the best. So the first thing is they got rid of the piked nose on the front. They kept the piked nose, but they decided to add a driver's housing on top of it for some reason, and this is where that bulge comes from that you've seen on the front of it, and also with the two kind of doors which come up, which basically mean that the driver would get bonked on the head with the gun. So they added this in, which basically just added a huge weak spot on the front of the vehicle, very similar to what the Valentine has with the flat part on the front. And also they added the turret that you all know well and love, which is, of course, the much fatter and taller one compared to the one that you've seen before. So basically, they added these two features, and both were seen as pretty negative. The reason why the turret is the way that it is because they wanted the max elevation and depression that they could get from it, and also still try and keep the armor up, and also kind of fit the vehicle. But the turret overlaps the horizontal area for the chassis, which is not great, creating a little bit of a shot gap, which was obviously not good. So basically, or a shot trap, I should say. So if you look at this area, they pretty much just added two places where the vehicle can just die from, which weren't there before. Now, this may have helped the driver a little bit, because maybe the driver was crazy cramped previously, but the turret itself, obviously designed in a way to house 3 crew, didn't really benefit the vehicle that much at all. So after all of these changes to it, which I think are overall negative, you ended up with a vehicle which was 27 tons It had access to a 210 horsepower engine, the GMC 6004, and the good old suspension was struggling. The speed also decreased to 19 kilometers an hour, and also it had kept the 6-pounder and supposedly had a coaxial 792, which, at least on the general design of the new turret, was kind of hard to see. So the vehicle itself really started to struggle, and they put it through mobility trials, and the driver just said no. He gave it a go, and there was too many issues with it. Now, a lot of these issues could have easily been fixed. The gearbox just needed like a slightly longer lever. When it came to the stiffness of certain areas of the driving, that could have also been fixed, and then also the stirrups of where you actually put, your feet for the brake, and also the other pedals were not aligned with where the driver was, so that could have all easily been fixed. But because of the fact that this vehicle was at a point in its development where it was well past its sell-by date in 1944-1945, if you compare it to its competition, with the war also shifting compared to 1942, also the fact that the specifications had been changed, and also the need for it was probably not required anymore, there wasn't any real further testing apart from the initial mobility stuff, which went badly. So this meant that this vehicle was just left in the lurch. It was very much similar to the Covenanter in a way, but the Covenanter has a much more successful story than the Valiant, and I think the Valiant is much more of an extreme case of, a design kind of getting outdated, but it is kind of sad for the vehicle. But as I've said many times, vehicles like this can easily work in War Thunder. They don't have the issues where the driver feels cramped, or, the vehicle itself would have, its bad areas, and you have the BR system, so it wouldn't have to face 1945-46 vehicles. So overall, it could easily work as an event or as a little bit of fun. But I just wish that at some point it comes to the game. I think it will eventually. It's just going to take a bit of time. As always, I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd like to thank Forge, Siegebreak, Carrion Crow, Nicholas Richardson, Elove Goat, Pyman, Winter Scientist, Merciless Reaper, Orange Tail, Teddy, Daniel Stanton, Moxie, B. Young, and also Sem Arslan, Wilkski, Uncle Bean, Derek R., Bareen, Lafouche, and Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.